Oh, I think the future for both for our field and for ISI is extremely bright in the sense that computer science is so central today to just about everything that people do. If you look at sort of the impact in terms of AI and what's going on in terms of these technologies like deep learning and natural language. I mean, so many things that we just take for granted today that we can do. The fact that you can talk to your phone. And I think that's really just the beginning. I think there's so many more opportunities and things that will actually come out of places like ISI that will have a huge impact. People are interested in working on building the next generation of technology and doing new things and solving these societal problems. What got me interested in computer science in general was actually in high school. It was some of the early days in the computers, and there was like one room in the entire building where they had a computer, and you can go connect, and you could basically play computer games and stuff, right? But it was sort of off on the side. Not many people knew about it, and so I'd go there during lunchtime with some of my friends, and then I managed to arrange it so that I actually went. As part of my high school days, I went to a technical school in the afternoons that actually was teaching a course in computers. So there was actually a course that was in a technical school that was part of the district. And so in the afternoon, after lunch sometime, I would go to this other school and then take these courses in computer science. And I loved it. I mean, to me, it was fascinating. And so I would spend afternoons there, and then I quickly got a job working there, both as an operator and then as a programmer for that organization and stuff. And so for me, it was incredibly engaging. It's like, you're given this interesting problem and it's like a puzzle, and you have to figure out, okay, how am I going to write a computer program to actually solve this problem? And it's totally engrossing in that you sit down to work on that, and hours and hours just go by, and before you know it, it's like late at night and you're still working on this program. And it's just incredibly rewarding in that you can actually make the computer do all of these interesting things. It was clear once I finished high school that I wanted to go study computer science in college. And then I went to Syracuse University, did my degree there in computer science. And at the time, they had a fantastic computer science program. It was incredibly competitive. So, they basically had an initial class in computer science that was like their weed out class, where their goal was, I think, to get 50% of the students to drop the class because they just couldn't accommodate so many students wanting to do computer science at that time. My first job in college was sitting in a room where they had all these brand new CRT screens, and they're worried that people were going to walk off with them. So my job that semester was to make sure no one left the room with any of the CRT screens that were in the room. And so 20 hours a week, I got to sit there and do my homework. It was great. And then after college, I discovered that I really loved to program in college. So then I went on to apply to graduate school and ended up going to Carnegie Mellon, which was a terrific environment for doing research and stuff. And I loved being in grad school. When I was in college, I took a course on AI from Alan Robinson, who's one of the early people in what was called resolution theorem proving, which is an area of sort of really early AI stuff. And I just thought the course was fascinating. I thought, wow, this is really interesting stuff. And I was able to actually then follow up on that and read some articles in the library and stuff, and discovered these really interesting articles by someone who's really quite well known now, Tom Mitchell, that I just thought this was really interesting stuff. And so then I decided, okay, if I'm going to go to grad school, what I really want to do is study AI. And so that was, some of the earliest work in AI was happening sort of in the I guess it was the early 80s. And then I applied to grad school and decided to go to Carnegie Mellon, and then worked with Jaime Carbonell and studied AI under him. I mean, really, at the time we were working on what was called automatic planning. So we built a system called Prodigy, which was actually all about how you could build sort of automatic techniques to create plans to solve interesting problems. And I did that for my dissertation work. And then after I graduated, I came to ISI. I mean, I went straight from grad school to working at ISI. And there I sort of shifted directions. I became much more interested in continuing to work in AI, but much more on sort of these problems in terms of what now referred to as sort of data integration. Now we call them sort of knowledge graphs, but it was really sort of very similar kinds of work where the basic problem is you're looking at some complicated problem where you have all this information spread across all these different sources. And the question is, how do you actually bring this information together and do this in some kind of meaningful way so you could then build things on top of it? I became particularly interested in how do you actually represent and sort of model the data that you're trying to bring together. And so one of the areas that I've focused on over my research career is this problem of what's sometimes referred to as sort of semantic modeling, right? So, or building semantic descriptions of data, right? So how do you can take a particular data source and understand what's in that data source, right? In terms of some kind of representation of the world. And so we have these things called domain ontologies, which are a description of a particular technical area, right? So you might, like recently we had a project where we were interested in actually integrating data about satellites. And so the idea is, in a problem like that, you have all this information that might come from different sources, right? So for satellites, we have data about the actual physical location of all of the satellites that are circling the Earth. And that's updated, multiple times a day for all the satellites. But then you have all kinds of other information. So you have information that might come out of news articles, information that are on blogs. You have all these websites that contain very detailed information about the satellites. And so the challenge there is, how do you actually represent what's coming out of all these different sources and then actually bring that together? And so we use AI techniques here to basically come up with the semantic representation, right? The description of the actual data. Right? And so you use a domain ontology that describes the space of satellites, and so it describes all of the different information that you want to represent about a satellite, and then you use that sort of domain model or ontology to then describe each of the individual sources. That particular project was funded by the Air Force, and their interest was really to get a better understanding that goes beyond, the Air Force knows where all the satellites are located, but they wanted to go beyond that and really understand, what else is there about these satellites that might tell us which satellites that we should actually be concerned about. And in particular, in that project, we were trying to understand were there particular satellites that maybe some foreign country had presented this as sort of some innocuous satellite, but might have some potential military use. And so we were looking at how you could actually identify which satellites that they should actually pay more attention to. And and if they decide that's a satellite they're concerned about, then they could just watch it more closely, right? Because it turns out tracking satellites is something that happens on some periodic basis. Ones that they're concerned about, they can just pay more attention to. And so to figure out which ones they might want to pay attention to, we were using some machine learning techniques where we could sort of learn a model of, well, what does a weather satellite actually look like, right? How is it typically configured? How much propulsion would it typically have? How does it actually behave in terms of movements and so on? And then once you have a model like that, then you can look for outliers, right? So you can say, okay, this satellite claimed to be a weather satellite, but it's somehow behaving very different than other weather satellites that you see. And so then you could actually fly. When I came to ISI, I joined in 1991 and started working on what was called the SIMS project. The challenge there was, similar to some of the problems we work on today, which is how you could bring this information together and make use of it. And I think it was in sort of a planning context, right? So how do you actually make use of this data that then you could use in various kind of planning problems for the military? Air campaign planning was an example of one of these things. So if the military has some military campaign and they have to, plan all of the different flights and sorties and stuff, then it's a very complicated problem in terms of all the different data that has to come together and all the different things that you need to bring together to decide, okay, which things are you going to actually go after in that particular campaign. I think it was a pretty exciting time because there was a lot of really interesting people at ISI working on interesting problems. And in that sort of era, it was also sort of the beginning of the web, where I remember coming to lunch one day and someone talking about all this new cool stuff that you could actually do on the World Wide Web, which is what people talked about at the time, where all of a sudden, all of these things became available that you didn't have access to before, that it opened up. And so one of the things that I think was really different in that era from today was the fact that it was still a period of time where we're working on sort of these long-term DARPA contracts. So we would get research funding. Usually it would be a three-year research grant. Mostly you'd work on a single project, right? So you'd have one project, which it's not, that's a thing of the past. And so you could really spend more time just thinking about the problems and thinking about the research project and just focusing your attention. There was probably, less administrative overhead. You didn't have to spend as much time sort of, writing proposals, because we only wrote another proposal every 3 years. And then once the 3 years was up, then you could usually write a follow-on proposal, so then you get another 3 years of funding for the same project. So, projects were really sort of 6-year projects and stuff. And I think that, created a sort of a little bit different environment where it was a little more relaxed and a little more time to actually interact with your colleagues and spend time on collaborative projects and work on things and stuff. And I'll give you an example, which is during that period of time, there were actually 3 separate projects from DARPA that were funded under a new DARPA program called Cooperative Agent-Based Systems. And the program manager, who was Jim Hendler, took over that program. And came to us and said, "You guys have 3 different projects." He says, "I'm not gonna fund 3 different projects. You guys need it. If you guys want to keep all that money," he says, "you need to put it together into one single, larger project," which was great. And so, the 3 groups actually then got together and spent, a significant amount of time sort of, thinking about, okay, what could we all do together that would be even more impactful? And we created this project called the Electric Elves, which was sort of a combination of work that my group was doing on sort of agent-based technology at the time. How do you create these sort of information agents to do various kinds of tasks? It also combined work that was happening in the knowledge representation group, where they were looking at how to represent knowledge for different kinds of things. So that was led by Bob McGregor at the time. And then Malin Tomby's group, who was working on he was also working on agents, but more from the point of view of how agents sort of interact with people and stuff, and so and people and organizations and stuff. And so the 3 groups got together, and we actually built sort of this environment for the Electric Elves that then did all these interesting things. So, for example, we built, as part of that, we built these elves for doing travel monitoring, which early days for all this information being available and stuff. And so I remember. At the time, these days there's apps that do this, but at the time I remember where I would land in a city, and before that time you land in a city and it's like if you're late, then you have to run and find a board and see what's happening to your flight, and and then try to run and catch the flight. And I remember I would land, and then my travel elf would have already sent me a text message that said, okay, your flight's leaving out of this gate. Here's the time. You have this many minutes to take the connection and stuff. And it would also do things like, I remember we had it set up so that it would actually fax the hotel. Because even today, sometimes if you get in really late, you arrive at the hotel, you have a reservation, and they'll say, "Oh, we're so sorry, we gave away a room. Here, we'll ship you off to a different hotel." But if you reached out to the hotel in advance and tell them that you were coming and you were going to be late, they would always hold the room for you, right? And so we actually had it set up so that the elves would actually send a fax to the hotel saying, okay, such and such is coming late, please make sure you hold the room for them and stuff. So this was a period where it was just at the beginning of the time when all of this data was available, right? So the technology like phones and stuff were really quite basic. Fax machines were still quite popular in that area in terms of how you communicated with organizations and stuff. And so it was, and it was really just at the point in time where the beginning when this was actually possible, right? The fact that, okay, I had access to the data about the flight schedules, right? I had access to all this information about, flight delays and that kind of stuff. Before that wasn't available to you, right? It was only available to the airlines or someone you called up on the phone and stuff. And so it was just the early days in terms of suddenly getting access to all this information that you didn't have access. And then I remember being very excited when we found a website where you could actually send an email and it would then automatically generate a fax for you. From my point of view, Electric Elves then led to a later project that we did in collaboration with SRI. But that was a project where it was a very ambitious project where it was, I think, sort of a later generation of sort of similar kinds of technologies and stuff. And out of that project came Siri. So one of the lead architect that worked on that project, he worked for SRI, then left SRI and started a startup company where they basically came up with the technology that Apple then acquired and led to Siri. So I'd say, it was, the early generation of that same kind of technology that led to the kinds of agents that we see today that basically people have taken for granted. But I think the other interesting part is actually what's going on behind the scenes, right? So what do you need on the technology side to actually make that happen? So getting access to the data, for example, was a really hard problem. So you had to, and in fact, what's interesting is that some of the early technologies, like to do the electric elves to monitor all these different things and stuff, that required us to build the technology to go off and basically be able to easily pull information out of websites and stuff. And so I had a student that worked on machine learning techniques for basically building what we call a wrapper for a website, right? So you have a website and it's like, okay, you can interact with it, you can get data from it, but now I need a computer program to basically interact with this site. And to do that, you need to actually be able to extract the information, the sort of the structured information that's on that site. And so I had a student, Jan Muslia, who built a machine learning techniques to essentially go to that site by example, give it some examples of the information you want to extract from it, and then it would learn basically the wrapper for going out and pulling the information from that site stuff. I still am and was very interested in working on geospatial data. And so we've done a number of, I think, really interesting projects that involve pulling information from all of these different sort of sources. And geospatial data includes things like maps and satellite imagery. So we did this one project, it was under a DARPA program called Active Templates, where the idea was to essentially create this technology for pulling together data from all these different sources and turning it into a form where you could then use it to solve various kinds of technical problems. I'll give you two examples of the kinds of problems we were solving there. One was for DARPA, what we were doing was building these things called intelligence packages. Right? Basically, this is in collaboration with special operations, where they need to go into some particular area, and suddenly they need to know all about that particular part of the world. And prior to the project that we worked on with them, what they would do is they would actually say, okay, let's imagine we're going to have a mission to this place in Africa. What do we need to know? And someone would spend months putting together all this data that they would need to know about that particular location, and then they would put it into a box. And if they ever then decide to go there, they pull it out and hope that it was actually still relevant to what they needed to do. And so what we did was we actually were working on building something that would basically create these sort of intelligence packages automatically, right? So it would essentially pull data from all of these different places, and part of that was pulling information that included details about satellite imagery, maps. It turned out at the time we worked with the NGA, which is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And they had all these maps, but what was really interesting to me was that after they created the maps, they would essentially throw them away because they figured, okay, if anyone needs a map for this particular area of the world, they'll just create a new one, right, for that area. But the problem was that lots of times for these more specialized projects and stuff, well, you couldn't just go to NGA and ask them to create the map. And so we actually then went to SOCOM, and they had all these historical data that they had collected over the years because they didn't throw away the maps. And so we pulled all this information together. It was sort of interesting because this information was very sort of spread out across all these different organizations. So we'd pull, the maps we would get from special operations, and then we'd get satellite imagery from another organization, and then we would get all this information about detailed location information. And then there was all this other information that you would also want to know about a given area. For example, you need to know about weather information, right? Sunrise, sunset times. You need to know about the terrain, what kinds of animals and plants are there. Are there dangerous animals, poisonous plants that you need to worry about? And so all of these things just came from different places and stuff. And so this was sort of a really interesting project where we basically would pull all this information from all these different places and then create this sort of, I guess they were called target intelligence packages for these things. Later, we then turned the same technology into something for doing travel planning. So we then sort of said, okay, there has to be other applications of the same sort of underlying technology, which is, it wasn't just pulling the data together. We also had this model for this way of sort of interacting with the system where you could sort of go through and sort of help you plan out a trip, right? So we said, well, it's similar kind of thing. You have all this different data you want to bring together. We have this sort of model of how a user might interact with the system in terms of, okay, they enter their location and their dates, And then the system can then pull information together from all these different places. And one of the interesting things is even today you don't really have this capability. I'll give you an example of it, which is that I specify the location I want to go to, and I specify the dates and stuff. And the system we put together would actually pull information together with the flights, the potential hotels, car rental information, things of interest that you might want to do in that location, and make it very easy to basically construct your plan sort of interactively, where all these things are sort of tied together, right? Once I say that, okay, I'm flying into this airport, then the car rentals, needs to come from that airport, and the hotel needs to be within some location of where you're going, and so on. Even today, I have to go to each one of these sites sort of separately. I can plan out your trip and sort of keep all the constraints in mind and stuff. And this system sort of did it all together. And at that time, we actually met with 3 or 4 of the major travel providers. Travelocity, Expedia, I don't remember exactly all the ones we met with, but we met with the big companies. They were quite interested. They would actually come to ISI, and we'd have meetings, and we'd sort of show them the demo of the system and stuff. And they thought it was great. The problem was that it did not fit their model, right? They couldn't figure out how they were going to actually, map it into what they were already doing today. And so we never actually got anyone to sort of push the technology and stuff. But the general technology, has lived down in all kinds of other projects that we've done later. I would say the most impactful project I've worked on at ISI is this project on combating human trafficking. And under that project, and this was part of a larger program where the program wasn't just about combating human trafficking. It was really about building knowledge graphs where you could rapidly create these domain-specific kinds of knowledge graphs to solve some technical problem in the world. And it was a really interesting DARPA program. But one of the first applications, and I think one of the most impactful applications, was actually addressing this particular problem, which is a huge problem in the US, which is how to address the problem of human trafficking. And under that program, the idea was that we collected something like 100 million web pages. So again, we're still collecting web pages for all kinds of projects, and then really making sense of them, right? So the problem for investigators when they're looking at these problems is that they don't have, they have access to Google. They don't have access to good tools that really help them understand what's actually happening or how they could actually locate someone who might be being trafficked. And the result of that project was actually pulling this data together in a way that a law enforcement agency could really effectively use the information and stuff. And so under that program, we're able to build, I think, this really interesting technology called Domain Insight Graphs, or DIG, where it would pull the data out of all these different web pages. I mean, this 100 million web pages, and organize it in a way that an investigator could then visualize what was actually happening. So it would essentially give them a view so they could actually see the patterns in the data, and they could use it in both finding potential traffickers and finding potential victims, and then use that in the actual prosecution of the cases. And I think one of the things that was rewarding for me was that we would then, after we developed this system. It was deployed to something like 400 different law enforcement agencies, but I know it was being used heavily in both New York City and San Francisco. And we had meetings with both district attorneys in both of those areas. And they talked about the impact that it had in terms of their ability to prosecute cases that they previously had not been able to prosecute, right? That they dramatically improved their success rate in terms of prosecuting traffickers. And then also helping them in terms of finding victims and stuff. And so I think that was pretty rewarding just because it had such a direct impact, and you could see what the impact was. I guess I see myself in society in terms of creating new technologies that basically can improve people's lives, right? So that we do things that have an impact, right? So I've always tried to work on projects that you weren't just doing the project so that you could write a paper about it, but that I wanted to see that, okay, you could write we want to publish papers, and I've published a lot of papers over the years, but I wanted to actually do things that would actually change something. In terms of how I've chosen what problems to work on, it really has been influenced by a variety of things, right? So being at ISI, since we have to come up with funding for projects, it's partly driven by what I can get research funding to actually work on, but not completely, right? So for example, sometimes you start projects before I know what the funding is for that, and then try to get funding for them and stuff. And then usually it's just driven by my sort of intellectual curiosity, right? These are things that, this looks like an interesting problem, where I find an interesting collaborator. And I'll give you an example, which is that one day someone called me up in my office and said, "Oh, we have some people here from a museum. Will you meet with them? Because we need someone to meet with them." I'm like, "Okay, sure, I'll meet with them." I had no idea what it was about, but it turned out that the meeting was with Eleanor Fink, who was formerly a director at the Getty Museum, and then a woman who is the current associate director at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And they wanted to do a project about art. And it was partly because Herb Shore had these, who had been a long-time art collector, had these relationships with the different museum communities and art communities, and so he apparently had invited them to come out and talk to us about projects. So I sat down and met with them, and I learned a little bit about their world and what kinds of things they were doing, and it just sounded really interesting, right? They had all this interesting data about artwork. They had no way to, currently to really sort of organize it or to bring it together across different museums. And then over time, we initially did a project first with the Smithsonian, where we said, okay, well, let's take the Smithsonian's data about all their artwork and see if we can then basically apply some of the techniques we've been working on in terms of representing the data and building a knowledge graph out of this museum data. And that project went really well, and we did some interesting stuff with them first. And then Eleanor Fink said, well, why don't we put this together in terms of a larger project where we actually bring together a bunch of different museums that are all focused on American art. So that resulted in the American Art Collective, where we had 13 museums that were all doing, had collections in American art. And so then we built this system that basically pulled the data together from all these different museums that then allowed us to build sort of really interesting applications on top of the data. So, now you could do things like build virtual museums, and you could explore the artwork by painter instead or artist instead of by the museum, because lots of times, you have a given artist and his work is spread over multiple museums and stuff. And so you could do interesting things, and you could look at, how this artist's work had changed over time, and how maybe their work was basically being influenced by different things in history and things that were going on and stuff. And so, but that was an example where it was just happened to be in my office, and someone said, "Oh, we need someone to meet with these people here," and it just kind of led to this sort of interesting project that then I worked on. There's certainly a conflict in the fact that you have these passions, and at the same time, then you need funding for them, because the conflict really comes in is if you can't align your passion with what you can actually get funding for. And the problem, of course, is that you have to convince someone to actually give you money, and it really depends on what the area is that you want them money to work on. Right? And one big challenge I've seen over the years at ISI is that what funding agencies want to fund changes over time, right? And that oftentimes that changes because what are the national needs in terms of what are the problems that the government views important to be solved? What does Congress want to be solved? And if you're really passionate about something that isn't aligned, then it can be a challenge. Okay, so I think one of the things that ISI has to contribute to the world is that it sits in this space that's different than both the corporate research labs and the academic departments, where it allows people to work on problems that go from the basic research all the way to some real-world problem. And I think it's different than an academic department because it allows people to really, I think, build real things that end up having an impact in society. And it's different from a corporate research organization in that people can really work on both the basic research problems and then how to actually apply them. I think what makes it a fun place to work is the people, right? So it has a really great group of people to collaborate with, to work with, and interesting problems to work on. I think one of the things that distinguishes it from places like Google or Amazon is that it's closer to an academic environment in the sense that, well, it's not an academic department, but at the same time, because we have this strong connection to the university, we have people that have faculty appointments at the university and stuff. It creates this environment where you have all these students. So today we have something like 150 students that work at ISI. And then you also have, the other side of it, which is you have, full-time research staff to help support the projects and help build things and stuff. So I think it's the combination of all those things that really make ISI a great environment. I think one of the things I really like about the academic environment is in fact the relationship between all the different researchers and people in sort of different generations and stuff. I mean, the entire time I've been at ISI, I've had PhD students working with me. So I've always had this opportunity to work with either PhD students or postdocs or younger researchers that maybe programmers and so on. And for me, it's been great because what I've found over the years is that you get stuck in the same sort of way you've been doing things in the same areas that you know about and stuff. And working with students as well as postdocs, really helps me learn about all these new things. Lots of times I discover that, well, I'm helping teach my PhD students how to do research. They're teaching me about the latest technologies, right? And the latest tools and the latest sort of ideas and techniques that I might not have kept up with and stuff. And it sort of forces me to really engage with, what's changing in the computer science world. And one of the challenges in computer science is things change so fast, right? That it's actually quite a challenge to both sort of do all the things you normally do in a day to get, to manage your projects and stuff, and to kind of keep up with all the things that are actually happening out there in the world. So I think that the environment in a place like ISI is great for that because, you have all these colleagues that are also working on all these different things that you learn about. You learn about things from them. And you have the students and postdocs that are also, coming from different places and have different experiences and skills. And it just keeps you from sort of, I think, stagnating. One of the great things about ISI is that it gives you the opportunity to work on the problems that you want to work on, right? So that, you have the environment where you come up with some ideas, you can propose it to some funding agency to get money for it. You have the access to students that, if it's a compelling problem, then you can get other people excited to work on that problem. And one of the great things, you really get to set your own agenda and focus on the things that excite you, and you get to spend time on the things that really are important to you. People should care that institutes like ISI exist because it allows people to work on problems that they think are important that maybe the other organizations like Google are not part of their agenda, right? If you go to work with Google, basically you're working on advertising, right? Pretty much everyone I know there works on some form of advertising because that's where Google makes their money. And one thing that's related to this is the fact that it's easy to move between problems at ISI, right? So it's not like, okay, once you go work for a given company, well, they have an agenda and you're going to work on that. At ISI, as your research interests change and the problems change, then you can change the kinds of problems that you work on. And that's one of the things I've really enjoyed working at ISI over the years is that I've, moved from one area to another area where, there are sort of application areas, and I've always really enjoyed learning about new application areas. That's been a fun part of the opportunity that ISI provides. When I came to ISI, I was very interested in just working on interesting research problems. Right? So, and research problems that could potentially have an impact. I mean, one of the things I really like about ISI, and I think is one of the strengths of it, is that people are there to work on things that will actually have an impact and make a difference. And so I think that a lot of the research focus on ISI is looking at sort of how you can apply interesting research that people are doing to real-world problems.